Good morning, and my name is Joe Waz, and I retired from Comcast after 17 years this past year, and for those of you who have been asking me what Altura LLC is, that's me. I just am setting up a new consultancy as I move to Los Angeles, and I'm also, looking forward to it with another fellow Angelino here. And I also have the pleasure of joining Phil Weiser and many other terrific people, Ray Gifford and many others at the University of Colorado as a senior fellow at the Silicon Flatirons program. So good to have everyone here. Thanks to Tom Leonard and Scott and TPI for this opportunity to moderate what I think is going to be a terrific panel with a lot of expertise and experience to call upon. And we only have 60 minutes to hear from them, so I'm going to try to get a few questions going to get us started. But this is going to be a question-driven panel, so I'm going to ask those of you in the audience to be ready with yours. And taking a page out of Scott's book as a fellow W, I'm going to start at the other end of the table and give Rick Witt, who also is in the back of every picture with me, every group picture we ever take, we're standing in the back. I'm going to give Rick the opportunity to be introduced first. So introducing the panel from my left to right. We'll start with Rick Witt, the Director and Managing Counsel for Telecom and Media for Google, and Rick's also a telecom industry veteran. Michael Powell, the President and CEO of the National Cable and Telecommunications Association, an FCC commissioner under President Clinton and then chair of the agency under President George W. Bush. Blair Levin, a Communications and Society Fellow at the Aspen Institute, based in Washington. He also served as Chief of Staff to FCC Chair Reed Hundt, and he's also a longtime industry equity analyst. Mike Gallagher, President and CEO of the Entertainment Software Association, who represents computer and video game publishers. And Mike, of course, is the former head of the National Telecommunications and Information Administration in the Department of Commerce. Kathy Brown, Senior Vice President, Public Policy Development and Corporate Responsibility for Verizon, who also served as Chief of Staff under FCC Chair Bill Kennard. And then finally, Dorothy Attwood, Senior Vice President, Global Public Policy at the Walt Disney Company. Dorothy's also a former Senior Executive and Chief Privacy Officer at AT&T, and she also served as a Senior Advisor as well as Bureau Chief under 2 FCC chairs. So welcome to all of you, great to have you here. Let's get started. We're coming up on about the 20th anniversary of what we could call the popular internet, as the internet began to make its way more broadly into society. And obviously it's impacted every one of your businesses for the folks sitting at the table. In at least one case, Rick, I'd say with Google, it created your business. I'd like to get a sense of the panel as we entered in 2011, as the internet continues itself to morph and change. We heard a lot about that on the last panel. Sort of pro and con, how is the internet affecting your various businesses? And Michael, let me start with you. I read last week that Glenn Britt of Time Warner Cable pretty much said his company's primary product is becoming high-speed internet, not traditional video. Has cable reached that point?
Well, I think for some cable companies, it's coming to that point. I mean, the internet and digitalization has been transformational for cable and other distributors because, first of all, it enabled the convergence of products that allowed you to create bundles and compete in traditional spaces you haven't competed in before. And so it's created a suite of applications that are core to the business beyond traditional video distribution. If you look at the economics of a lot of cable companies, increasingly, contrary to some popular opinion, the phone and broadband components are actually critical drivers of their economic well-being. And I think that Glenn's statement is also just a recognition and increasingly thinking about content separated by category as opposed to understanding its value as data over data-centric infrastructure is probably the wrong way to look at it. And I think that increasingly over time, more and more cable companies do think of themselves first and foremost as broadband providers.
Mm-hmm. And Kathy, Verizon came to this world from a more traditional common carrier and phone background. Now that the company's a broadband and growing increasingly a wireless player, how do you see these impacts?
So first, let me thank Tom Leonard for inviting us here, and also regrets from Tom Talkie, who was supposed to be here. He got a little sidetracked with some internal matters at our company this week, and I was reflecting on just that issue and this question. Because what is going on right now in our company and others is this real, is a dialogue about what's changed and what does that mean for companies like ours. People have indeed cut the cord. Our wireline business has, in fact, declined quarter over quarter over quarter, and frankly, I am pleased, very pleased that our leadership in the company saw fit to understand the future a little bit, and over the last years have invested more money than any other company in the United States, by the way. AT&T is right behind us. More money than any other company in the United States in capital investment to change who it is. So it now has the fiber network that no one else in the world has to the home. It now is the leader in LTE deployment, and it has deployed an amazing internet backbone all over the world that carries much of the world's internet traffic. So very, very different company than it was when those pieces were being put together by Verizon, by Ivan Seidenberg. Listening now to our new CEO, who I hope you all get to meet, Lowell McAdam, who does indeed come out of the wireless side, but not before. He wasn't with Pac Bell back in the day. So very interesting. And what does he talk about now? He talks about us as a part of a collaborative ecosystem, that we don't do any of this by ourselves, that we're an essential ingredient into the connectivity in the world, but that it's all about our partners. And that doesn't just include the people at this table, most of them who are now partners with us in delivering services, but also partners in what I call the adjacent markets. So a lot of talk over the last 2 days about traditional telephony. But where we see things going is into solutions. Healthcare, education, energy, public safety, and we're going to be there as a solution provider with incredible assets to bring this digital revolution finally to the whole rest of not only the US society, but we believe globally as well.
Very good. Dorothy Attwood, I think that a lot of people perceive that the internet has had a particularly disruptive effect on Hollywood and content creation. I think you might disagree.
Yeah, and I'll pick up from the last panel. I think it's, I thank you for the question, because there's oftentimes two different rooms going on, one where the innovators and the internet people are, and the others where the disrupted industry media, typically newspaper publishers, music, content creators exist, and there's a woe is me over there, and then there's all this sort of value being created in the internet, and I can't, the benefit of really feeling like that's fundamentally wrong. I think the content industry is much more properly viewed as being a fostering internet innovation, being an essential ingredient with the rest of the folks on this table, whether you're a network operator, whether you're a software or a hardware application provider, whether you're an operating system, whether you have developed premium content. It actually is a way to increase the growth of the internet. It isn't a disruptive, the internet isn't disruptive to that. And I would say that also from the perspective of Walt Disney Company. We were the first content provider to be on iTunes in 2005. We were the first content provider to be on a mobile platform, full-length episodes on a platform. We have, through ABC Player, we were the first to offer a direct-to-market, full-length subscription, ad-supported product. We also launched with the iPad in 2010, the ABC application. So the idea, and I think actually, I know Tom is in the audience here. I think that Ann Sweeney, our head of our media networks, came to this very conference a couple years ago and described how we view the internet as a way to expand the pie and not as a way that actually disrupts the way in which we can make money. And I think what was missing a little bit in the last panel is the notion that 1 + 1 can equal 3 when you're dealing with innovation and when you're dealing with the capabilities of really integrating digital content and digital distribution in new ways to enhance the customer experience. As a company that's driven entirely by the customer, we look, it's not just media networks, it's, we're the largest publication of children's books. So ebooks that can have content that is literally three-dimensional embedded in the book experience, that is something where you may reach an entire new class of consumer by the experience that's created. Tom's the fact that we are also involved in social gaming. Mike knows we have a huge interest in the platforms and some of the most popular virtual games, and that's because our customers want to engage in that. The way in which we can then use premium content to enhance that experience and create, again, new opportunities. It's critically important, we think, to think of content as driving that innovation, as being part of that bubble. Now, it's not without challenges. Certainly, challenges for a company like Disney involve where to distribute the content, and that includes important issues around continued support for the brand. We can't just put our content on any medium. We have to evaluate those on a case-by-case basis because, for example, if it's an uncurated distribution platform and you have Little Mermaid appear right next to Ariel Does Dallas, that's not going to work for us. So we need, and part of the openness of the internet is that it provides those capabilities of associating. So we have to be we work very closely with the new distribution platforms to make sure that, in fact, it protects our brands and that kind of thing. And in addition to that, of course, we all know there's piracy and theft challenges that are created by the medium. But overall, the excitement and the capabilities are adjuncts to our business, not disruptors.
And I want to come back to the piracy point in due course here as well. Mike Gallagher, your industry has been, I think it's safe to say, a little bit slower in the transition. You were primarily a cartridge and then a disc-based industry, then things like PS3 and other boxes started adding connectivity so you could play against competitors elsewhere. But now you're seeing an even more significant change in terms of web-based content. Could you talk a bit about that?
Sure, it's probably best to answer that question, Joe, in the context of 1974, which was the peak of human existence, according to our speaker last night. And I'll present a choice to the audience. You can have an HD, surround sound, 3D experience connected to people around the world where you are operating the system through voice control and gestures, and you can have that. Or you can have the Magnavox Odyssey, which was the predecessor by 2 years to Pong in 1974. So I would say that, that from our industry, we see rapid growth and plenty of opportunity in what's going on right now. 4 years ago, the video game industry was a $19 billion industry, about half of that revenue coming from hardware, the consoles, which are very familiar to all of us, the Wii, the PlayStation 3, and the Xbox 360, and the other half was software. Today, just 4 years later, through very difficult economic times, we're a $25 billion industry. And we're seeing that growth coming from three primary forces in the marketplace that we're very excited about. The first one is deeply immersive, great entertainment experiences that are the biggest entertainment releases in the world, are video games. Far bigger than movies. A few examples. Halo 3 came out in 2007, and that was a $350 million game in its first week. A year later, GTA 4 came out, $500 million in its opening week. And this last 2 years, the Call of Duty franchise took that to a new level, and the most recent version came out last November, did $500 million on day one, no, $360 million on day one, $600 million in its first week, and $1 billion in its first 6 weeks. And just to give you a context of what does that mean, what are people doing? Over the first 6 weeks that Call of Duty was on the market, there were 600 million hours of Call of Duty played. And for those of you that don't have a calculator, that's 68,000 years of gameplay happened in the first 6 weeks that the title was released. So blockbusters and that core experience is a key driver of that growth. And again, that's connected gameplay. This is done online, and we're taking full advantage of that as an industry. It's a very important driver. Second is cutting-edge, fun, accessible technology for consumers. If you look at the Wii transformed video games through motion-based controls. Now you have the PlayStation 3 with Move, and you have Microsoft's Xbox 360, which has Kinect, which takes voice commands and gesture commands, as it takes the controller out of your hands, as a way of interfacing with video games. In our view, we're redefining the interface between humans and machines. It's happening in the consumer space in our industry, and we innovate by offering great, exciting devices. Now, we could have stopped there and enjoyed that success, but at E3 this last June, just a couple of months ago, Nintendo announced the new Wii U. Also, the 3DS has been in the market for a year. Handheld 3D, no glasses, video game play. And then also the PlayStation Vita was released or announced by Sony. So continuing to offer great and exciting hardware. And the final thing is harnessing social and mobile. We're seeing incredible growth. Most of that $6 billion growth has come from these new areas of revenue. And when you look at just a few examples, iPhone apps, all time, paid download iPhone apps, 8 of the top 10 are video games. So our industry has moved squarely into that, sees great opportunity, and we offer it free to play, prepaid. Also through social gaming, you have microtransaction models, which are very positive, offered by Playdom, which is a subsidiary of Disney, Playfish, a subsidiary of EA, Zynga, who I'm sure many of us have heard of. All of these models are thriving, alive and thriving within the video game industry, and are very, very exciting. So it's those three forces, Joe, that are driving the industry and that top-line revenue growth.
Very good. And Rick Wade, Google has built something of a blockbuster on the internet over the last decade or so. How do you see the state of the net today?
Sure. So, I mean, as you indicated, we found our birth and our rise and success on the internet as a platform. So we strongly believe in it because of the way it lowers barriers to entry for lots of new kinds of businesses. In fact, there are studies out there showing, along with what Dorothy just said, that for every one job that's lost in the internet economy, there are actually 2.5 jobs created. So it is really creative destruction in the sense that you both have some industries which are reforming, reshaping themselves, and the new opportunities also presenting themselves at the same time. Just on the Google side, I wanted to point out that we did a study based on activities last year and determined that there's something like $64 billion with a B in economic value that we helped to generate for mostly smaller businesses around the country through AdSense and AdWords and other programs that we have. We think that just is a testament to the kinds of things that can be done on the internet. There's so much more that can be done. We hope to do even more of that this year, but I think that's just one small indication of the kinds of seismic shifts that are happening as more and more business goes online.
Very good. And Blair, Levin, you do a lot of thinking about this. You helped mastermind the broadband plan for the FCC, and your current capacity at Aspen, I'm sure you've got a lot of thoughts on the state of play as well.
Yeah, I swear to God this is true. As we were finishing up the broadband plan, there was we all had a great time, but there was some concern that the government wouldn't actually implement what we had done. And I began my closing address to the team with the following quote from Winston Churchill. Yeah, you've actually already heard it. But I actually do believe it to be true. I think the ideas about Spectrum, USF, there are many. I feel confident that every good idea in the plan actually will ultimately be implemented after the government has tried everything else. But let me just say that, first of all, as to the implementation, we have to be fair to the policymakers, and moving a plan to policy is like moving a book to a movie. And sometimes I feel like Mario Puzo watching Godfather 1, and then sometimes I feel like Mario Puzo watching Godfather 3 and wondering who allowed Coppola to cast his daughter in that role. But I won't tell you which parts I think of as Godfather 1 and Godfather 3. I will say that I think the most important piece written recently on this state of the internet was Mark Andreessen's piece in the Wall Street Journal Saturday. For those of you who didn't see it, basically it's how software eats up every industry. And that transformation that Mike was talking about is from, it's a transition to software. He pointed out 2 areas where it's not true yet, healthcare and education. We spent a lot of time. He's absolutely right about that. He's saying he's making a lot of investments, and I think that's really great. There are a lot of things the government can do to facilitate that transition to making those industries far more productive. I would just say one idea that I kind of have been focused on a little bit since we left, but as an idea I deeply believe in, which is we should eliminate all state textbook adoption boards, and because that would help us facilitate the movement from analog, that is to say textbook digital content transmission, to digital transition. And I'll just close by saying that when I told this to an audience where there were a number of people in the audience who worked in these state textbook adoption boards, it went over as well as when I spoke to the rural folks about how we need to reform universal service. But nonetheless, this is the point, which is that eventually we do have to do the right thing, and getting rid of analog textbooks is the right thing, getting rid of a lot of things in healthcare and replacing them with software. That's really the big picture. As you can see in Andreessen's piece, there's a lot of good things going on there. I may have peaked in 1974 myself, but I don't really think that the American spirit of innovation did.
Very good. In the last couple of days, we've been focusing on a lot of sort of the next range of challenges around the internet, cybersecurity, privacy, and intellectual property protection. And let me, with this panel for a second, focus in on the last one of those a bit more. So Dorothy and Michael, the companies that you represent, the content companies like Disney and the music industry, I know Mitch Glazier and others are here from music, and in the ISP world, Comcast, Time Warner, and Kathy, AT&T, I'm sorry, Verizon as well.
Not allowed.
Huh? When you flip those investment numbers on me, you got me confused. You guys are the leader in investment now. Reached a milestone agreement back in July on protecting intellectual property. And it's really the first time that ISPs and the content community have come together in a plan to fight piracy. I think to describe it briefly, it involves a series, some of you were in the IP workshop yesterday, but it involves ISPs agreeing to send a series of copyright alerts to consumers whose accounts are identified as having been used for the purpose of sending illegal content, particularly at the moment it's movies, TV, video, and music. And it's a progressive series of alerts that are really intended to focus on education and deterrence and driving consumers to other outlets. I think another interesting aspect of it is the degree to which it involved some feedback from the advocacy community. The MOU itself, I guess, was published, and a number of groups had given some input on it before it was finalized. So let me start with Dorothy and get your sense of, does this represent, first of all, does this represent a new day? Secondly, do you see that this is going to work? And third, what else ought we be doing in this space?
Well, we could finish the rest of our talk on that topic, but I guess since we're in the penultimate panel and we've said a lot of things over the course of the conference, I'll make the observation that that the MOU was important not just because it's an important outcome to, in fact, fight piracy, and this is a tool in the arsenal that we're hopeful will have some impact. But I think more broadly speaking, I think the process of that, as well as other discussions ongoing in the context of piracy, privacy, security, issues that relate to kind of the health of the internet. I'm optimistic and hopeful that what the MOU represents and what also the discussions around that are around other involvement by banks and financial institutions that are ongoing now, that it reflects an appreciation for kind of a broader principle of accountability. The idea that the community can get together and say, there's no value in, for example, criminality. And where I am in a position to help support and nurture the kind of community, the virtual community that's important for all of us, which includes a secure community, it includes a community that respects private information, it includes a community that has no tolerance for criminal behavior that exploits anyone's property, from the small guy to the large guy. I'm hopeful that the dialogue with the ISPs moved from a world of pointing fingers or accusing to a world that says, let's construct the kind of virtual community that's important to us. And I think it's one of many. I don't think I'm hopeful that the dialogue that has started is one that can be a healthy one. It's not the first. I actually want to point out the underappreciated event of the UGC principles, which people on this panel are part of. And those were really emblematic also of recognizing that there are multiple interests at stake, and the community we want to develop that inspires innovation, that in fact encourages respect for property, that in fact is healthy for end users, was really involved in that. And if, the UGC is a user-generated content, and certainly at the outset of the burgeoning of user-generated content, there were lots of questions about what about if that content was in fact stolen, and lots of concerns by the content community that premium content would be used. And rather than create a, rather than point fingers, through a process that my general counsel was very involved with, and many people in this room were involved with, there was sitting down and really listening to interests that a YouTube would have that said, wait a minute, I don't want to inhibit the growth of this really exciting early new form of entertainment. We want to encourage it, but I also don't want to encourage theft. And so how do we get together and create principles that will in fact operate to protect and advance both of these legitimate interests that are incredibly important. And what happened was a set of principles that operate with all of the major UGC sites now in this country and also internationally, increasingly. China just, a major UGC site in China just agreed to them, in which there is actually pre-uploaded filters that in fact allow copyright owners to exert in the context of premium content, that allow them to exert before the content gets used by users, to exert the right, but doesn't prohibit, ends up a bar to, in fact, the creation of lots of new content that uses various portions of some premium content. So it actually is a testament to if the industry and all interests can get together and talk about principles that advance the multiple agenda that will ultimately lead to more and more use of the internet, we can actually see really good things and all of the principles grow. And so I'm hopeful that the MOU is an example of that, and the dialogue and the trust that's starting to build among communities to in fact recognize all of these interests are important. I'm optimistic that it's just, it's part of the process and it will continue.
So Michael, Kathy, Rick, do you share that optimism and that approach?
I do. I mean, I would say a few things. I mean, I think it's worthy of following because I think it's a notable achievement on a number of scores. Number one, I think to echo Dorothy's point, I mean, it really is done in the spirit of a cooperative recognition of both the significance of the problem. And I would involve the government too here. They were a major player in both stimulating the parties to come together to produce the result and have stood by it as an important role that they play with respect to law enforcement. So I think it's notable in the cooperative spirit. I think it's also notable that it has a heavy educational focus. I mean, it is largely driven on data that supported the premise that 70% of users, if they understood something were illegal, wouldn't consume it, or whether you could develop an educational set of processes that would help consumers find legal alternatives that would provide a choice. Because a lot of times what you hear from consumers is they want what they want. They're not out to steal, but they're out to get what they want. And then increasingly, when there are alternatives, they'd be willing to take them. And I think finally it was notable, which I think was important to many ISPs, these are our paying customers, and we've learned a lot of lessons about what not to do. And I think people wanted to make sure that the mitigation was focused on education and didn't demand and require something more extraordinary like automatic termination or 3 strikes and you're out, that we wouldn't be obligated as an industry to treat our customers that hostilely without more process, even though that's within the rights under the Digital Millennium Copyright Act.
Right. Kathy, anything to add from an ISP perspective?
I would have made the same 3 points as Michael just made. I would make 2 more, and that is that the multi-stakeholder processes here are hard. So we're going to spend a lot of time on this, but they take time. And we need to get better at that so that we can do these things faster. This whole agreement actually was preceded by one early on, a couple of years ago, between Verizon and Disney for the same exact sort of handing off notices. We've had that in place for quite a while. It proved very successful. As Michael says, and with each notice you send out, the percentage goes down of the problem you have. Now, what's left are hardcore criminals. So what's left, and we can talk more about this, is piracy that's actually going on outside of the U.S., in which, hats off to the Obama administration, they've been trying to do much more at the border with stuff that's just purely illegal. Now, the hard parts of these, when you get into the nitty-gritty, is the liability issues. Who's responsible for criminals? How do you do law enforcement that's effective across borders? Mike has this with his games constantly. We've sat and talked about this at length. How do you make sure that we have a safe environment both for consumers to operate in, but also for companies to innovate, put their stuff, which is worth a lot of money? The second point I would make then is that these issues go international very easily and we've spent a lot of time on this at the OECD, frankly, and they involve very strongly held beliefs of people who, on the one hand, want freedom, and on the other hand, want security, and they take a long time to work through. The alternative, however, of strict kind of regulatory kinds of approaches won't work. The opposite of norms and procedures, safe harbors, kinds of things we've been hearing about, we think do have some promise. And I think this whole area is around the maturation of this new medium. It's about the maturation of human creativity. We hope, as Blair says, that that's now going to emerge in even more important areas than video, although most people on this panel don't think there's any more important areas than video. There are. We're going to be talking about medical technology. We're going to be talking about things that are life and death with public safety. We're talking about our kids' education. We've got to get these things sorted out because the security, privacy, the reliability of these networks and these functionalities are going to become, and already are, so embedded in the way we actually do work that I think that these experiments are enormously important.
And Rick, is Google, I guess I'll put it in the form of a question, is Google a stakeholder in this space as well, and how do you approach the
Sure, absolutely, and I'm not really the copyright expert on my here today. In fact, I'm just the telecom guy, and I'd be remiss in not mentioning that Pablo Chavez was supposed to be in this spot, but he was had to stay in D.C., so I'm both much shorter and much more handsome than Pablo is. But I would say, we were very pleased to be, part of that effort. And from our perspective, obviously, I mean, agree with everything that was said. Piracy is something that we need to try to get our hands on. From our perspective, particularly from the YouTube view, fair use is something that's very important to us, and to the end user content, which incorporates some elements of third-party content. We wanted to make sure that that had a viable seat at the table, and it did. So that was all to the good.
And I guess as part of the education process, and I've heard this again from some of the internet advocacy groups, you've got to give the full picture, right, of rights and responsibilities in terms of what consumers can do, including what is fair use, and
right.
How can you do a matchup, and what's within the bounds. You all actually did an animation on that, on rights, and it got interesting reactions. I thought it was one of the best shots I've seen anybody take at trying to define sort of rights and responsibilities, but I'm not sure if the online community agreed. Are you going to continue that effort to try to educate that way?
Sure, to the extent people watch the videos, we'll be happy to keep producing them. We certainly like to avoid some of the more draconian measures that have been suggested in the past, including the 3-strike rules and ISPs kind of stepping in. So anything short of that will take care of the piracy problems and educate folks on how to get content through the lawful means we're all for that.
Very good, very good. Let's turn the conversation for a couple of minutes, and then I would like to start recognizing folks for questions in about 5 or 10 minutes. to merger policy and government reviews. For as long as I've been around this business, major mergers and acquisitions have really, particularly in the internet space and the telecom space, have led to policy decisions that wind up having a broader impact on how the internet operates. I was involved in the approvals process for Comcast, NBC, Universal earlier this year, and it sort of put into play the relationship between distributors and content providers, both how content providers get access to networks and how content that is owned by vertically integrated companies deals with competitive distributors. The pending AT&T T-Mobile merger is putting into play questions about how competitive the wireless marketplace is, and some analysts are suggesting that there's a risk that that transaction will lead to new regulations for others in the wireless space. So, but let me start with the news of the last couple of weeks, Rick, with Google making what I think is the single largest acquisition in its history with Motorola Mobility. Some analysts are saying it's about patents. Some are saying, well, maybe it's about video and set-top boxes. Whatever it's about, let's assume it's going to go forward. What do you see as some of the public policy implications of your transaction?
Well, first, a couple of general points around merger policy. Google generally does not get involved in transactions at the FCC, including the two large ones you mentioned. Mm-hmm. We tend to stay out of those types of reviews, although we will and have responded to questions from the antitrust authorities. Some have argued that the FCC role is largely redundant, particularly when you have antitrust authorities also taking a look at these transactions. Again, we don't necessarily have a position. I will say, there's been this notion that the competition authorities tend to do best when they take on the so-called structural remedies, and then the FCC is often left to take on the behavioral remedies, quote unquote. In my perspective, at least, the latter has had a less than stellar track record. The commission generally does not do a good job of going back after the fact to determine whether any of the remedies that were put in place actually have accomplished anything. I guess where I sit, the structural will make more sense than the behavioral, to the extent there are actually legitimate problems need to be addressed in the market. With regard to what's been called Google Rolla, or Moto Moogle, I really can't discuss any detailed post-merger plans at this point. We do take seriously the concept that we are not supposed to be influencing business decisions by our friends at Motorola Mobility, directly or indirectly, before we actually close. And that certainly includes public statements in settings like this. For our part, Google will stick with its current public policy views at the FCC and elsewhere. Commentators have focused, of course, on the three aspects of the deal, the patent portfolio, the set-top box business, and the handset business. We believe a vertical transaction like this one actually will be very good for competition across the board. And we'll be, of course, fully cooperating with the Department of Justice as they review our HSR filing. The FCC portion really should be largely pro forma. It's literally a couple of aeronautical and industrial and experimental licenses, so we don't see that that's necessarily going to be a platform for lots of consternation, but of course it is DC. As I say, it is DC, so
licenses that seem to be enough of a
cars licenses
it will not shock me. But just a few quick observations. So we think the two companies together will in fact accelerate innovation and choice in the mobile computing space, which is really, at this point, very much a free-for-all in terms of all the different providers, the different layers of the network who are competing and collaborating with each other in many ways. Consumers will get better phones at lower prices. We think Android is really the best open source option out there to date for mobile computing. It will continue to be open source after the transaction. It will be available to all device manufacturers and software developers. We've already gotten some very nice supportive statements from all of our friends in the hardware community, our partners in Android, including Samsung, Sony Ericsson, HTC, and LG. We also think that this software is vital to competition because it ensures that the hardware manufacturers, the mobile phone providers, and the consumers all have choices at the different layers. And in fact, we think this deal will give us an opportunity on the set-top box side to explore some different innovative opportunities with our friends in the cable community as well.
Great. I think most of the panelists here have been either involved on the reviewing end or the receiving end of merger processes. Anybody want to offer any other comments on Rick's observations generally or in specific?
I was just sitting here thinking about the behavioral. Now, Michael Powell and I got into this all the time because he always was no conditions on a merger, and you can remember there were many conditions on various mergers. And so, Michael, with time, we do get smarter, you know, but I want to just remember, I mean, by the way, I mean me, not him. He was always the smarter one. But let me just say something. I remember one in particular that I like to bring up, and it was the Time Warner AOL merger. And we spent forever more trying to figure out whether there was going to be a corner on the instant messaging market. And that we needed to do something to ensure that there wasn't a tipping point so that one company would actually become the only provider of instant messaging. And we put conditions on that merger, you will remember. Well, this was really, I think one day when I'm done, I'm going to write a paper on this because, honestly, not only did that not happen, did the market go a completely different way, but let's even look at that merger as to what the government was so nervous about the whole time. That is not to say that there are not antitrust issues that have to be looked at, but I think that the antitrust authorities, frankly, have the better rule of law advantage than what are behavioral agencies that are very much involved with, oh goodness, how are consumers going to, SBC merger, I remember this one too, how are they really going to react to this very immediate thing rather than the big structural issues that are out there. So Michael, really, over to you.
I feel abused somehow.
You shouldn't. You were right.
You know, Joe, one thing that you asked, what are the implications for regulatory policy? I mean, I've always been intrigued in the regulatory sphere, the special boogeyman we associate with vertical integration. It is regularly used to sort of ignite an enormous amount of anxiety in the regulatory space, often quickly leading to desires for sort of a priori or regulatory responses, which is interesting because when I worked at the antitrust division, I mean, there's a whole body of scholarship about how overblown some of the sort of per se fears are associated with vertical integration. And if you really went through a lot of mergers that are vertical integrated mergers, you know, sort of the great parade of horribles, I think there are fewer, not more, examples of. So, you know, by Google, you know, I don't know what they're going to do with any of it. We're watching with bated breath. But, you know, it starts to be interesting when companies who have historically been in the regulatory policy space being able to sort of purely represent kind of a single set of product lines that are mostly horizontal or not vertical, you know, start to have to cope with, you know, Rick, whether he likes or not, will be accused of all kinds of bad things that they purportedly will be able to do. You know, this you'll remember as soon as the new commission took over, there was a huge rush of effort to try to draw in the FCC to Apple's App Store environment under the same kind of thesis of that vertical integrated power. I think the commission wisely did nothing more than send letters. But it will change the thinking, you know, I think, and it has this special place in regulatory policy that I've never fully comprehended.
Very good. Before we throw this open to the audience, I want to pick up on something about next generation networks and ask Blair about a project he's working on now at Aspen. It's called gig.u. I won't forget the dot. I guess it's a project with 32 leading universities to try to find an economically sound way to next generation networks. You want to tell us more about it?
Sure. Just very quickly, there are two propositions I think everyone in the room would agree with. First, that there's the one that comes out of the National Broadband Plan, which is there would be a tremendous benefit to the country if there is a critical mass of test beds that have world-leading connectivity. And the second proposition is that the best targets for such test beds are university communities. Happy to go into why those two things are true, but I think they're almost non-objectionable. And so the question is, how do we take that insight and make sure, in kind of the same way that we need to make sure that on kind of the low end of the network, we get networks everywhere, we get everybody on them, we also have to keep driving research and development. And we're not going to depend, as despite the speaker this morning, very articulate, but Bell Labs is not going to do it for us in the way it did it for us in the past. So the idea is these 32 universities, and actually it'll be a little bit larger by the time we actually do the RFI, in conjunction with their communities, sitting down with a number of folks here and a number of other folks, service providers, application developers, and others, to try to figure out how do we close the private investment gap between the cost of deployment and the demand. That gap is lowest in university communities, and we're coming up with a lot of different kind of creative thoughts about how best to do it.
Michael, Kathy, is this an attractive project, do you think, to your respective industries and companies?
I think so. I mean, I would first of all commend Blair for doing more than just writing a report, but then heading out in the world and trying to bring into being this vision, and the idea of, focusing small for big impact, I think is a smart strategic choice of his. And I think, we're watching it and think it's interesting. And I think a lot of companies will continue to be in discussion with Blair about the opportunity it presents.
Look, just think about where we have put FiOS in New York, Pennsylvania, Philly, DC. These are all centers of huge universities. We are making enormous investments in a network that can do 100 megabits and more. No one is buying 100 megabits right now. They're hardly buying 50. They're buying 20 maybe. Most people are quite content with their 5 up or 10 up and 5 down. What are we going to do to actually take this network that we have built and bring it to its highest capacity? What are the applications? What are the innovations that will, on a network we actually have already laid in the ground? How is that going to prove itself out in these dreams we've had that this is going to be the way to change things? So I know that Blair is interested in having new investment. I'm interested in actually making some money on the investment that's there. And so we're starting to talk.
Can I just respond to that? Because I think that is the fundamental problem we have, and it's a chicken and egg problem. Can we get the innovations without people having networks? Can we actually build those networks out without a business model? And I'll be the first to say there's not a business model for gigabit connectivity per se in the United States. This is a long-term play. This is about making sure that not just Google, and I commend Google for what they're doing with the Google Fiber project, but I would like to have it in this country that they're more than just Google that knows how to build a gigabit service, knows how to offer it, and more than just Kansas City that's playing around with it. And the simple idea is that if you give 1 million college kids and their professors in those communities, and by the way, I'm not sure there's ever going to be, a lot of people tried to convince us that we ought to have a national goal of a gigabit everywhere. I thought that was the wrong goal. But certainly in these communities where we have doctors who are already using a gigabit to look at MRIs, certainly in communities where you have already existing some of the best networks, let's take some low-lying fruit and let's bet on the talent, the energy, the ingenuity of Americans, and have this kind of distributed wiki collaborative platform for research and innovation. Won't just drive, I think, gigabit applications, but will also help answer your question, because as you drive higher bandwidth applications, more people will be buying the 100 megabit stuff. But you got to do the applications, and you got to have to drive both sides of it.
Mike?
What I would say, putting my old government service hat on, is I would also commend Blair for doing this, because it does take those critical elements that are very frothy and combustible, and you don't know what's quite going to come out of them, and you put it there and you see what happens, and it lets us as a country, going back to the previous discussions we've had here at this conference, it puts us in a position to be able to develop those world-leading things, that next thing, in a very, very fertile environment. So from the government service perspective, from that perspective from the past, I'm excited about it. From where our industry sits today, I think the model's the right one, because we're doing things with education right now, but they're very focused on proving the concept for real in a real environment with real kids. Mm-hmm. And if you do that, then it will scale. But if you just talk about it in theory, there's not a lot of traction and there's no money for those things.
Kathy, let me give you the last word on this, and then we'll go to the
One
audience.
last word, and that is in Link, put your head up, because we've already, I want you to give the number, we've already done the test that would get the FiOS network up to gigabit. 1 gig at a home location. So our network with those electronics on either side will do it.
A number of places, that's all.
And so if you talk to our folks, they say, and yes, for what? So it is a chicken and egg problem, And I think it's one that we want to really, we want to talk about, we want to think through.
Very good. All right, with this, let me throw it open to questions from the audience, of which I'm sure there are some, even though we're in the last panel, the last day. David? And by the way, the protocol is to just identify yourself and wait for the mic, so there you go.
Hi, David Comcast. Hi, so we actually surprisingly didn't get much into mobile broadband. I'd like to hear, obviously Rick and Google's Android platform, and Kathy, your company is obviously investing billions of dollars in mobile broadband. Is fixed broadband going to go the way of wireline telephony, or is there a place for both mobile broadband and wireline broadband in the future?
I think it's a very big pie. I do think, however, mobility on a LTE network where, we're saying that you get 10 to 12 megabits in your hand, but we're actually, someone told me they were getting 28. Now, we're not fully deployed yet, and people aren't on mobile phones on networks in each city at the penetration we assume, but the engineering is going to allow for much higher mobile broadband than we saw before. Now, go back to Mike's industry, however, and the latency issue, which is much, much improved, by the way, on LTE. So that's going to be the next breakthrough, is that you start to not have the latency. But you compare that to our fiber network. He knows we laugh about this all the time. Folks who are on Fios beat anyone else, anytime, anywhere. If you have,
My son will testify to that.
Yeah, they will, because the latency is just about nothing. So for Mike's industry, which, by the way, fills up those pipes, so we're all for him, those kinds of applications are still going to be super fast, right, and super better on the Fios network. Moreover, I believe that some of the medical applications that are going to come up, and some of the higher order kinds of applications, which frankly, the gaming industry is actually getting out there in a game format, but that will be used for other kinds of things, will also require this kind of connectivity. That is not to say, however, that the world is not moving to a wireless world. And if you look at the US and around the world, the penetration in wireless is the greatest we have seen in any technology, any time, ever in our world. So it is an amazing thing that's happening here.
I'd also just comment that it goes back to the 1 + 1 = 3. I mean, you actually see great opportunities for new content creation and new consumer experience. ESPN just announced a relationship with Foursquare where you sign in at a sporting event and individuals can get personalized content sent to them for that event at that time with their fan groups. And those kinds of things were made possible through mobility and in conjunction with creating sort of new, interesting consumer experiences and content, are just in the beginning. So,
what I would add is is the gentleman from Level 3 still here? Yeah. Over here. I think if you look at his numbers, it's physically impossible for radio frequency spectrum to carry the volume of data, especially at the growth rates that were described this morning in the opening keynote. And the path that's on. It's just not possible to push all that data into, if you had all the RF, all of it, you got rid of every incumbent user today, put everything out there, it can't be done. So as a matter of physics, it can't all be on wireless. But what happens is it's going to be a scalable experience. You're going to take your entertainment, whether it's video games or anything else, and it'll be on your device, and then you'll port that into your home, and it'll be on a much bigger screen going through a bigger pipe.
I also think we forget how much wireless networks are wired. They are much more wired than you might think. And so the suggestion that one replaces the other, to me, is a little bit fiction.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And as well, I mean, we see the world, the future, basically as the cloud, right? No great surprise, but that your content is out there and that you access it at different places, different points in time, and you'll get maybe lesser quality in some place and put up with it because that's okay for you there. But if you're sitting at home watching an HD movie, you want the best possible reception. So I think we have to sort of watch what the consumers want and try to do the best we can to fill in the gaps.
Great. So I hope my host will let us go another 5 minutes here or so. We've got a question in the back. Fernando?
Thanks, Fernando LaGuardia. There's been discussion at this conference, but also articles recently about the phenomenon of growing income and wealth gap disparity. And so I wanted to ask about whether you think that's a threat to the industry or the ecosystem as you participate in it or see it, And if so, why? If not, why not?
Kathy?
I need to translate that just a little more. The
Less subscribers.
less subscribers.
Is it on? Okay.
Now it is.
So the question is whether you see growing income and wealth disparity as a problem for telecommunications and technology. And if so, why? And if not, why not? And perhaps you can comment on what you think should be done about that from the perspective of industry or policy.
Look at the Bernstein report of a couple of weeks ago, talks about 40% of households having no discretionary income. That's not a good bit of news for us who are selling things into households. Now, what we found in this great recession was, as usual, we're a lagging indicator, right? So the last thing people were giving up was, and Michael, you might comment on this, but to keep their home entertainment, they'd certainly keep their cell phone.
And they go to the movies.
And they go, it's interesting, it's very interesting. Now, there comes a point, however, when your healthcare costs are going to trump, your the cost that and the rising cost of every household has done with telecommunications, which has been startling. But if you look around the world and you think about what even the analyst said last night and what we heard much earlier, it's still our industry that is leading the way because we're still involved in the whole transformation of everything else. So while I think that this is a tough period for every business, small, large, and what's going on in households, I think it's also the engine for growth out of it.
First, I would have to object to the question because it's a why question. And then very, very quickly.
How about a weather answer then?
And the very quick answer is, I also think that's a disturbing trend because it drives piracy. If free is the only alternative and that's all they can afford, that's obviously making a very, very significant problem even harder.
If I could, first of all, the Stanford report, which I think was actually in the spring, though they keep rewriting it, probably the single most important report in the sector written this year. And the reason is because it means the growth prospects for value-added services is very difficult. And as Craig Moffett pointed out in the report, it also means that the transition to things good enough, I think is the phrase used, is like Netflix as a replacement for a cable package. So I think it's a very, very significant thing and something we should worry about. There's a second thing, which is I think as we go in this period, the government is going to outsource its, what I think are fundamentally governmental social problems, the most important of which is adoption, to the industry, because the government won't think it has the means to solve it, so it will say to, as it has, to a Comcast or a CenturyLink, you solve our problem of adoption. And I would just say that we can argue about that, but I actually think there are a lot of things the government could do. The quick idea, the government should, for its own sake, announce that it's going to get rid of all paper transactions within 5 years, because it would save the government a lot of money, as every business knows if you move to the electronic platform, but then work with people who are not adopters to move them on, but utilize the increase in the value proposition to achieve that goal. But you can't, the services and the networks that were built were designed to be universal services. You take 40% of the population out of it, it suddenly changes the economics dramatically, and I think is very problematic.
Very good. All right, so that we can get to lunch and our two commissioners in a reasonable time frame here, let me wrap things up with one last question for the entire panel. It sounds like in September we're going to hear a whole lot of pronouncements about how the different parties and the different players in Washington are going to create jobs. Jobs, jobs, jobs is the mantra. So let me ask each of you in order this, and I'll start with Dorothy on this.
No, we were going with the W's, remember? That was the principle.
To give Dorothy time to think about her answer. Let me start with Rick and ask, in the next 12 months, either a government measure, a measure you might take, a measure an NGO might take, what is the single most important thing that can be done to stimulate job growth?
Wow. Well, as is mentioned, job growth in the communications, internet sectors have been actually pretty good. It's one of the few bright spots. So on the internet side, I would say the government should largely do what it's doing, largely stay out of it, allow businesses to continue proliferating and grow more jobs there. On the communication side, I guess we're involved at the FCC in the dreaded ICC USF reform process. We think a simple recognition that broadband should be covered by universal service and subsidized in some ways so we can actually get that infrastructure to places it isn't today is in essence a jobs program and can create added value, of course, for the people who can get broadband in those communities where they're not being served today. So I guess off the cuff, that would be one I would suggest.
Great. Michael?
I think it's said a lot, but I think the greatest impediment right now for a lot of business investment is the massive amount of regulatory uncertainty across virtually every sector that affects the per unit labor cost. So when a company sits down and says, if I add one more person, what is the per unit labor cost around that? There are a whole swirling around that person are a whole bunch of uncertain questions about whether you factor in additional expense for that, everything from healthcare to environmental to regulatory. And I really do think the president has talked about this, but I think it needs to be even more rigorously committed to in practice, which is there's a whole lot of stuff that's just hanging over, right? It doesn't settle, it doesn't get resolved, it's just out there. And I think that it really creates a huge disincentive to take the risk to invest in labor when labor is not something you want to turn on and off every other week, depending on where the regulatory proceeding is. So I would just make a further appeal that I think the single greatest thing the government could do is to try to take certain things either off the table and do so clearly, openly, and notoriously, or get them resolved in a way that we can make business judgments around.
Very good. Blair, is the answer in the plan?
Well, the most important thing is it's not geeked.eu, but I can't help but when we launched, John Doerr tweeted GR8 as in great for job creation. I think he's right. It's about upgrade cycles. In the 90s, we had 8 million of the 22 million jobs that were created by the economy really went to the fact that you had this growth in the internet and the growth in wireless, and there was an upgrade of both those networks and of devices and of the applications. And so driving upgrade cycles, I think, is incredibly important for job creation.
Very good.
I would say tax reform, because it's going to be private sector employers that are going to lead us out of the hole that we are in. It's takes unconstrained capital flows to make that happen. And the best way to incent the flow of that capital and create those jobs is by getting the incentives right that are in the tax code.
Very good.
I would say that two top priorities I know, because that's what I'm walking back into the office to do, is one, tax reform. And we have heard that we're talking both about corporate and individual tax reform. If we don't have discretionary spending in households that can spend, that's a problem. If we don't have people investing, that's a problem. It seems to me there's a couple of large efforts right now on both sides of the aisle, and including, and when I talk to folks at the White House, a willingness to think about what that looks like as a stimulative effect in and of itself, to get money out there, to get people buying so that people get back to work, number one. And number two, for us, it's the input issue. We've got to solve the spectrum issue. And that's huge right now. It's on the table. Again, it's immediately on the table, we believe, and will be on the table in the deficit reduction talks, and we need to get it right.
Very good. Dorothy, I know you have your answer now.
Right. Well, so I'll associate myself with the comments of all of the panelists. In addition to that, I would probably add the untraditional reform or relaxation of travel restrictions, because I have a few places that people who come from other countries might want to visit in Orlando and Anaheim. And so that would drive a lot of value for the American economy and the hospitality industry. And so I would suggest that's another driver.
Terrific, thanks. I want to thank everyone for a great panel. And call Mr. Leonard forward to tell us where to go next.